start by thanking CJ for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel today, and to thank my fellow panelists for the really excellent work that they're doing in the public and within the discipline to take on the nitty-gritty of this study and its impact and its history and genesis. I'm going to do something a little bit different today, and I feel really grateful for the opportunity. This study made me wander around my house in my sweatpants, muttering to myself and my partner, and so I'm really grateful that now I can mutter to all of you. I want to draw back the lens a little bit and offer just a few really brief comments about the frame of the entire conversation that we're having, both in this room and within the discipline, and also the larger political conversation that we're having, and the ways distinct cultures of social science research exist, but often go unnoticed or uninterrogated. And my colleagues have already done a terrific job arguing about some of the limitations of the core methodology of the study and the policy debates within the media that the study informs. The primary impact of the study, it seems clear at this point, has been this singular argument that children raised in so-called gay households are somehow less psychologically healthy than their peers in nuclear marital families. And in the writing itself, and in the subsequent sort of more popular writing that Regnerus has done, he insinuates that the hope is to improve somehow the lives of the children who are parented by, individuals who've had same-sex relationships. But it seems pretty clear to all of us that the real point of the study is tied to both legal and political efforts to restrict the legal recognition of gay and lesbian families. And so I want to just sort of take a step back from all of that for a minute and pose a simple and so far pretty much overlooked question, which is, what does it mean rhetorically and ethically to ask the empirical question, how different is one group of people from another? In particular, what cultural work is done by a kind of social science that takes a dominant group, one that's given a certain amount of institutional and political support, as a comparison point against which to measure the lives and well-being of members of subordinated classes. So in answer to this question, I want to make three brief points. First, that the categories we use in our research not only reflect, but actually construct the social realities within which we live. Number two, that this idea of difference in and of itself implies a kind of value judgment, right? When we say that two things are different, that's not a value-neutral analysis. And three, that these questions about difference form their own kind of political imperatives, right? So if we decide that there is this kind of difference, what does that actually mean? And then what does it mean in terms of the sorts of responses that are compelled by the people who are said to be quote-unquote different, right? So it's sort of old news to those of us on sort of the more left of this so-called, wait, what are we, a liberal discipline? Is that what we are? I'm not sure, but that's another panel. But right, it's old news to some of us at this point that social scientists actually have the power to produce certain forms of inequality through the construction of the very categories we use, right? As Dorothy Smith argued 2 decades ago, what she called SNAF, which is one of my favorite acronyms, the Standard North American Family, or what we've been calling today IBF, which sounds like some sort of intestinal disorder, is as much an ideological code as it is a descriptive term. And by that, Smith meant that the idea that there is a dominant, stable, heterodyadic family unit works much like a genetic code, reproducing its characteristic forms in order across discursive sites from the media to government bureaucracies and scientific practices. The Regnerus analysis is a perfect example of how this works. In and of itself, it installs the heterosexual marital family, as what we've already called, the gold standard for all comparison, even as he himself admits in various pieces of his writing that it's far from statistically dominant. Further, it's clear that the category for gay parents that he instructs neither accurately corresponds to, nor does it really help elucidate the practices, motivations, interests, or experiences of the individuals that he purports to study. The implication, even before the analysis begins, is that there is a singular gold standard for human relationship against which all others are to be measured. That standard makes deviations a moral choice, one seemingly divorced from the social, cultural, and institutional pressures that might frame the same-sex behavior of his survey participants. The idea is that when we look for the ways a subordinated group is different from the dominant group, particularly when those differences we plan to measure have to do with psychological health, we automatically position that group as deficient. We also risk masking the kinds of structural and cultural disadvantages they face with some purportedly value-neutral concept of inherent personal or relational characteristics. This difference versus no difference debate is in and of itself a conservative political ploy aimed at a mass media landscape. It's not value-neutral. And as Judith Stacy has argued, the discursive regime of what she calls virtual social science imposes conservative epistemological frameworks on sociological speech that invisibly undermine even overtly critical messages. C. Wright Mills' democratic social sphere, she tells us, is now a soundbite sphere. And as a consequence for progressive social scientists, the very act of participating risks reinforcing structures of thought and value antithetical to critical sociological stances and to issues of social justice. So what she's essentially saying is, what Regnerus does is throw down the gauntlet and circumscribe the kind of conversation that we as social scientists are having about what it actually means that gay families exist, or really more realistically, what it actually means that some parents might choose to sleep with people of the same sex, right? So the question already draws boundaries around what this debate has to look like, and we as queer or allied social scientists sort of rise to the call and respond, but we respond within those same terms that we never set out to begin with, right? So I want to argue today that it's time to stop taking the bait. It's time to stop having these kinds of conversations about queer families. If we believe that there's a value in investigating how to help certain groups, let's say the children of gay parents, thrive, then we need to make that the focus, not assigning blame. What social scientists have proven again and again is that the structural conditions that scaffold family life and the cultural support of surrounding communities have tremendous effects on the well-being of individual parents and children alike. Abby Goldberg and Julianne Z. Smith found evidence that the favorability of the legal climate towards LGBT families correlated significantly with better psychological health for both LGBT parents and their children. Lick, Tornello, and a bunch of others in 2012 found that the social climate and perceived social supports for LGBT families also predicted the well-being of children raised in gay and lesbian households, irrespective of what the actual sexual orientation of those individual children were. And in in-depth interviews with the children of gay and lesbian parents, Blanca, Leslie, and Radina found that both interpersonal enactments and structural disadvantages were salient features of social life for youth, things that they talked about, things that they worried about, things that affected their quality of life. These youth reported engaging in self-protective measures in the face of cultural homophobia that ranged from being fearful to openly defiant to simply detached in the face of discrimination by others. This sounds an awful lot like the kinds of psychological outcomes that Regnerus seems to be concerned about, right? And so we can tie them to this idea that interpersonal enactments of homophobia might be to blame for some of these things that he's very excited that he's found. So these kinds of interpersonal coping mechanisms infect not only social relationships, but also personal health. How this works for the children of gay and lesbian parents is unclear, but we do already know how it works for LGBT children themselves. Caitlin Ryan at San Francisco State University has demonstrated that the bullying and harassment experienced by students, even perceived by their peers to be LGBT but heterosexually identified, led directly to lower levels of life satisfaction and higher rates of depression in young adulthood. Might some version of this be true for children whose parents are perceived or who actually are LGBT, right? We don't know, because we haven't asked that question. A 2009 article in the journal Pediatrics reported that young adults who experienced high levels of rejection on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity were significantly more likely to attempt suicide and experience depression and to attempt to self-medicate with alcohol and illegal drugs than were LGBT youth who grew up in affirming and supportive environments. What this says to me is that the things that adults say and do to kids, not just LGBT kids, but to any kids, affect the way those kids feel about themselves and what they believe their chances are for living a happy life. So is comparing family forms and rating some better than others really the best that we can do for these children and their LGBT or same-sex practicing, we might say, or whatever, parents, right? Perhaps the next step for those of us with an interest in supporting youth should be to examine, in this sort of nuanced detail, the impact of cultural heterosexism and homophobia on family stability and youth outcomes. If what we want is better child outcomes and more solid and enduring connections between parents and children, our energies would be better spent asking different questions. Questions like, how can we ensure that children receive the social supports they need to thrive? How can we, as a culture or as a discipline, nurture people through difficult life transitions like divorce so they can keep their relationship to their children intact? How can we mitigate the forces of social intolerance on the fragile emotional lives of vulnerable youth? These are the sorts of inquiries that promise some hope of improving the lives of children. Now, I think it's really important, really actually fundamentally important for me to mention that I'm the gay parent of a young child. And I can testify firsthand that the publication of studies like the NFSS exact a particular form of psychic violence on families like mine, on scholars like me. I can withstand the accusations of instability and unfitness it levies at my partner and I can disregard the cultural assumption that my daughter will be somehow harmed by the form of love we choose to provide her with, that some people in my community disregard my family as less valuable or worthy of support than other families. I can sit in rooms like this one at professional conferences and watch my peers and colleagues dispassionately debate the legitimacy of my relationship and the fundamental right of my family to exist. The question is not whether or not I can withstand that. The question is whether I should have to withstand that. The question is what sort of an intellectual project is sociology if it demands that of me or of you? So one single point sort of bears repeating, one that seems to be often left out of these kinds of public manifestations of gay family politics. The point of comparative work on the relative social desirability of certain forms of love and care is never to scaffold, protect, or meaningfully enhance the life experience of research subjects. Instead, studies like this one demean and devalue the primary relationships in their subjects' lives. By asking the question, are these families and parents of survey respondents legitimate, sufficient, healthy, Regnerus and his colleagues engage in tactics of humiliation that mask themselves in the cloak of social science. It's clear that the parents of his survey respondents were in no meaningful way gay and lesbian parents, with air quotes around that phrase, and yet with a linguistic flourish he divests those families of their integrity, their dignity, and their right to basic acknowledgement, respect, and protection. This very fact puts LGBT and allied social scientists in a precarious, rhetorical, and moral position. We're called upon to respond, reply, critique, and engage Regnerus and his colleagues, and in so doing, to accept the terms of this debate his research sets forth. The publication of this study and the subsequent debate that it mandates are instances of the way social science itself can become a dangerous instrument of cultural heterosexism and homophobia. As Barbara Risman so aptly pointed out, quote, "It is high time that as a discipline, we have an open discussion about whether the editorial policies at our major journals privilege the allegedly value-free versions of science over versions of a social science that include value commitments to a more just world. In the more just world that I imagine, I would not be called upon to argue dispassionately for my own basic right to live, to parent, and to love my family, and to assume an intellectual and emotional armor that we tend to call professionalism." Thank you.